Welcome back to Breaking Points. I'm Ryan Grimm, DC Bureau Chief of The Intercept. And as promised, we're here with some partnership content. Here with my colleague, Ken Klippenstein, who's going to talk about a big story that he broke this week about the CIA director, and Saudi Arabia. So tell people a little bit about what you found.
Yeah, so CIA Director William Burns, about whom there's been relatively little reporting so far, has been in a whirlwind tour of the Middle East, which included a meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, which in itself is a kind of concession to the Crown Prince, because Burns himself is a former diplomat who's very respected in the region, and even talking to critics of the administration in interviews for this story, people sort of conceded, yes, he's very good at his job, he's very well connected. So a meeting of that sort is kind of like a gift to MBS.
And also a little unusual, right? The CIA director is not a diplomat.
Exactly. And when I spoke to folks in both the intelligence community and the national security world for this story, a lot of them were angry about that. They were saying this is not how you're supposed to do diplomacy. And so, the question arose, so then why are they doing it this way? And what I was told is that there are a few advantages to using a CIA director to conduct essentially covert foreign policy, covert diplomacy. And one big one is discretion. It means that it's not going to come out.
except for here it is. So let's step back and talk about why this is important. Obviously, one reason it's important is climate change. The other reason it's important is gas prices. But the geopolitical implications of it are profound, because after the butchering and the bone sawing of Jamal Khashoggi, Washington Post journalist, who also was planning, I've mentioned this before, on starting to write columns for The Intercept before he was, I don't know if I've told you that before he was killed by MBS in a Turkish consulate. After that, finally, Washington turns against Saudi Arabia. But the question of how significant that turn is now being answered. You had Joe Biden during the presidential campaign saying that he would not meet with Mohammed bin Salman, who is the crown prince. He's the de facto ruler, but he's not the king. So he's not the official ruler. And so Biden says, I will talk to the actual king, not to MBS. And he called him a pariah. And we still hear that all the time. And so as a result, MBS has said, fine, you don't want to talk to me? How do you like $4 a gallon at the pump? And so what have been the Biden administration's efforts so far to stick to their, he's a pariah, we're not talking to him, while also trying to get gas prices down? Like what do they do up to Burns? Because Burns feels like almost a Hail Mary attempt.
I think that's exactly what it is. And from what I'm told at the meeting, they explicitly discussed oil prices and request to increase them, not just because of the soaring inflation rate, which that contributes to in the United States, but this sort of underlies all of international trade, and because oil—
Everything costs, everything needs energy.
Exactly.
You drive up the price of energy, you drive up the price of everything. Yeah.
Right, and this is becoming a particularly acute issue for the Democrats as we move into midterms. There's any amount of political science research that suggests that just consumer prices, gas prices, oil prices, coming into an election has a very significant effect on voter behavior. So I think that's exactly what that was, a Hail Mary of sorts. And so they discussed it. My understanding is that there wasn't an agreement on that.
Was not an agreement.
Yes, on the oil production increase. But this is also becoming a geopolitically important topic, because this is a bonanza of profits for Russia as they invade Ukraine, and it just gives them so much more operating space to be able to do things that they wouldn't have the resources to do otherwise. And so I think that's why we're seeing even more urgency than there has been in the past to try to change that. But again, it seems like they haven't come into any sort of agreement about it.
And you've written about how twice in the past, MBS has actually helped out an American president in an election year. Talk about that.
Yeah, I've noticed whenever I do these stories, I always have these sort of glib responses that are like, oh, the president can't control oil prices, that kind of thing. And it's like, well, he did to some extent in the past. So in the case of Donald Trump, he influenced oil production in both directions during the coronavirus pandemic to protect domestic shale production, which was cratering in terms of the revenue that they were developing. He asked MBS to decrease production. MBS didn't want to initially, and then he threatened. He said, well, I'm going to pull the military out, and good luck defending yourself against the Iranians and against all these other regional adversaries. Lo and behold, MBS suddenly sees the light and says, okay, yeah, that's great. We can decrease production. That's fine. He did that, and then prior to that, both times being in election seasons in 2020 and then in 2018 during the midterm elections, he asked him to increase oil production. MBS agreed to do so. And it's only now that he's choosing not to do so in response to the president's requests.
So you also reported that Burns brought up these sensitive negotiations with between Saudi Arabia and China over ICBMs.
Yeah.
So what have we known about that, and what did you learn about this?
This is another angle to the U.S. Riyadh relationship that is of intense interest to Washington. That being MBS repeatedly making very public overtures to both the Russians in the middle of this invasion of Ukraine and also the Chinese.
They floated that maybe we'll sell oil in yuan, which China has been asking for a long time.
A profound change. I mean, that would just totally undercut the whole system of economic dominance that the U.S. has set up.
My own take, unlikely, I think, to happen because
I agree.
China has capital controls.
Right.
And so you would then be taking money that China then still completely controls. And so it's just not as useful to you to have yuan as it is to have dollars. So you'd be taking a massive hit. So China would have to do a lot in order to make it worth your while. However, maybe that lot means an ICBM.
Right. So, the economic component has been well known and pretty well reported. What's less well known is the Chinese to Saudi military relationship, which they are using Chinese scientists. There's a program going on where they try to enrich uranium for the Saudi nuclear program. And now, my understanding from several intelligence sources is that they are trying to import completed ballistic missiles from China, and this is causing a lot of irritation in both the CIA and the State Department, because the relationship traditionally has been, U.S. provides military assistance and sales, not one of these geopolitical adversaries.
And so a lot of people on the, say, progressive left have said, like, well, hey, why do you want them to pump more oil? Pumping more oil is just going to burn the planet that much faster. Why are you so worked up about these negotiations between the Biden administration and Saudi Arabia over oil production? Shouldn't we be glad that Mohammed bin Salman is becoming a Green New Deal guy? What's your response to that? Well,
I'm of two minds, because I think that keeping oil prices high does incentivize alternative energy and a shift towards that. But at the same time, the system that we have, the infrastructure that we have in place, depends on that oil as a commodity, and you can't just completely extricate yourself from it without having set up the infrastructure for a new oil system, which we just don't have. So the effect, unfortunately, if this persists in the way that it has been, I think is going to be a recession. So I'm sort of of two minds about the question.
Right, and not to put you on too much on the spot, because I know you're not an opinion journalist. You go out and get the facts, and the world can do what they want with the facts. But it is the case that, like you said, we don't have the structure yet.
Right.
That's why they're proposing a Green New Deal. They haven't even written the text of what a Green New Deal would look like, let alone even get the credits, the different energy credits through because of Manchin so far. We'll see where that goes. And so if you don't have it, all you're doing is creating suffering around the world. Now, yes, it's true that the higher gas prices go, the more people use less and try to move off of fossil fuels. But the studies also show that if people think that it's going to be transitory, and people can identify, like, oh, this is why this particular thing is happening, it's not like they're going to instantly go out and buy a Tesla. And most people can't instantly go out and buy a Tesla. And so all you end up doing is empowering, ironically, kind of the allies of the fossil fuel industry, because then they say, oh, look, gas is $4 a gallon under Democrats, got to put us in, and we're going to drill more, we're going to do all these other things that are going to get prices down.
That's clearly the messaging on the part of the oil industry is, hey, look, we didn't frack enough, and that's why we have these problems, rather than this entire suite of geopolitical problems.
We need more subsidies.
Exactly,
yeah. And so what does it say that Blinken and the State Department were kind of cut out of this trip to Riyadh? And do we know anything more about the kind of long-term goals of this type of diplomacy? Because it's coming on the back end of the Abraham Accords, which were described as a peace deal, but as we know, they did not involve the Palestinians. People are like, wow, Jared Kushner solved the Mideast problem. Yeah, he solved it by pretending that the Palestinians don't exist, and by getting kind of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and some others to also say, okay, fine, Palestinians don't exist. Palestinians actually, turns out, do still exist. Shireen Akleh, killed by what appears to be by Israeli forces this week, during a raid in Jenin. And so the Abraham Accords, I think incorrectly described as a peace deal, more accurately described as basically a business deal, with layered over with geopolitics. And the business deal is, all right, these countries are going to recognize and normalize relations with Israel. Israel's going to share its surveillance technology. They have some of the most sophisticated kind of cyber hacking and other surveillance
which is of great interest to authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia that really don't want any sort of, not even democracy, just like dissent in general.
And it appears that Israeli technology, perhaps rooted through the UAE, was central to hacking the Jamal Khashoggi's phone, the phone of Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée.
People all over the world too.
Right.
I mean, it's
journalists and exactly. So those are the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
And so then it's not as if the Biden administration has just abandoned the Abraham Accords. That's kind of the foundation of where we're going forward now from here, which is this kind of alliance between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And so how does the CIA director's trip to Saudi Arabia kind of fit into what's next for this kind of regional relationship?
Right. So to answer your first question, what does it say about Blinken and the State Department? It shows that Biden was not serious when he was campaigning on, I think he said, empowering diplomacy in a way that the Trump administration, rightly in his criticism, did not do and needed to do. It shows that, I mean, it's a zero-sum thing. When you're empowering the CIA, as one intelligence official said to me, CIA is going to look for the CIA. Maybe they'll try to help you on some issues, but they have their own set of interests that are just fundamentally different than what the State Departments and what diplomats are. And I think that the second thing that it shows is the deteriorating relationship between top Biden administration officials and MBS. So we have a report in the Wall Street Journal several months ago that described Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, bringing up Khashoggi in a meeting with MBS, and MBS screaming at him and saying, you can forget about oil production. Right. And my understanding is that that's more or less the nature of the relationship between him and Blinken and between other top Biden administration officials. For whatever reason, that enmity didn't exist between the CIA director and him. And my understanding is that that's a big part of the reason they tapped him to do this. But as you point out, this is regional in nature. There have been other reports of Burns handling diplomacy. There was just a report yesterday, I think, that he traveled to Brazil to meet with Bolsonaro. And my sources tell me that in addition to meeting with MBS, he also met with the Crown Prince of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed. He also went to Doha in Qatar. He went to Oman. And if I was to care, I mean, the meetings differ in key respects, but the common thread here is kind of like what you were getting at before, which is pushing them towards some kind of a regional agreement that I think looks similar in a lot of respects to the Abraham Accords.
Right. And how does the Iran deal kind of fit into all of this? Because we keep seeing that we're 95% of the way towards an Iran deal. Could be struck any moment, could also just fall apart. This is the nuclear deal that Obama struck with Iran over the objections of Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia that then Trump walked out on. Not because he opposed the deal at all, but because it was Obama's. Like he was just like, what did Obama do? I'm gonna try to rip it out, root and branch. And so he walks out of that. Now we're walking back into it, awkwardly so, because Russia is one of the countries that is on our side of the negotiations with Iran, because everybody, Europe, Russia, us, we all have the same interest in preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And so how does the progress of that re-deal kind of play into this kind of regional deal that you're writing, written about?
What's interesting about these Gulf Arab states, if you look at the messaging around the reinstatement of the JCPOA, the Iran deal, it's a lot less hostile than it was last time around. And I think the reason for that is a recognition of that there needs to be some kind of regional stability. So if you talk to folks close to the governments in those regions, what they'll tell you is that Iran's drone swarm attack on a Saudi oil facility, I think in 2019, was a huge sea change in the region's understanding It was almost like the defeat of the Spanish Armada, because it was this recognition of, whoa, not only can they blow up our economy, they can blow up the world economy by spending very little money with these, drone systems to be able to do that. And I think after that, there's a lot more recognition of like, okay, maybe the JCPOA wasn't so, maybe the Iran deal wasn't so bad after all.
Yeah, and Abu Dhabi too. You had some probably Iranian-supplied Houthi drones that finally were able to get into UAE airspace, and I think 3 or 4 civilians were killed eventually through some drone strikes, just because they're not the most sophisticated drones. Well, the U.S. has extremely sophisticated drone strikes, and 90% of the people that we kill are civilians. So you can imagine that that a Houthi drone strike on Abu Dhabi, which isn't really a military target, what they're doing, but nor are the UAE or Saudi Arabia restricting themselves to military targets. They've been using famine and indiscriminate bombing and torture as a mechanism of their war effort. So I think you're right that the attacks on the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, there was an attack right before the Formula One race in Saudi Arabia, and you had all of these F1 drivers and owners being like, wait a minute.
Or in the UAE, you look at the effect, the economy, the stock market there plummeted after that, because there was this fiction of that, we don't have to worry about anything because Iran hasn't really done anything in the past. Well, it turns out they haven't done anything in the past because they chose not to. It doesn't mean that they can't,
Right, it would be as if the U.S. were kind of waging a little guerrilla war on Canada for 5-6 years and assuring everybody that, hey, this is just a thing that we're doing. Don't worry, you can still come to the World Series. And all of a sudden, there's a drone strike in Boston and people are killed, or in Manhattan. You could see how, despite the fact that that's a small number of deaths compared to the hundreds of thousands that have died in Yemen, because it shatters this myth that they're immune from the violence that they're perpetrating in Yemen, that all of a sudden people are like, well, you know what? I think we're actually going to have the conference that we were planning for there. We're going to have that in Barcelona. Or because there's a lot of places that we can have a conference.
I think there's a lot of incentive to reinstate Iran, and you're seeing other indications of that being overtures to Venezuela, which you couldn't imagine like a few years ago. I mean, this shows how desperate they are to not just move away from Saudi UAE oil, which has become fraught for the reasons I've described, but to try to have some other oil supply that you can rely on to kind of mitigate the effects of angry MBS or an angry MBZ. And so to me, it's sort of surprising that they haven't reinstated the Iran deal at this point. But and I think if you talk to people close to the negotiations, they seem sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't say like, confident that it's not going to happen, but they're by no means convinced that it will come to pass. It's still very much in the air.
Right. So in conclusion, things that are good, peace, clean energy. Things that are bad, oil, war. War is great for business until it's not. And I think the region is finding out the hard way. When it gets to be not. Great reporting. Thanks so much for coming by on Breaking Points, and thanks to Krystal and Saagar for having us here. What we're going to try to do is when we have big stories, interesting stories that we think you guys are going to be interested in, we'll pop by here and tell you about them. Thanks, Ken.
Good to be with you.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.